Welcome to our 13th Open Clock Club. And wherever you are on the planet, please let us know in the live chat. We've got Team Open Clock Club here, as always, making sure that your communications are passed on to me as well as we go along. We've had a really busy week here. It's been it's been really great. Particularly, it's been fantastic seeing your projects on Facebook. So those of you that have joined our Facebook group, then thank you for that. Please join up. It's a private group, but if you just apply, we take anybody, of course. And it's been fantastic to see your projects sharing those. So please keep that going. We're all learning as we go along. So the usual housekeeping rule is that we put this. Hi Rob. We put this this video up on our Open Clock Club archive page, which is incredibly popular. I can't quite get over that. I know I say that every week. So if you want to remain anonymous is the point, then please keep your camera turned off. So yeah, the live chat is really important to us, so keep that coming. It's one of our favorite things to go through that after the event and pick things out. And that's going to be one of our things that gets us going tonight. Now, you may remember in the mists of time. Oh, and by the way, extra special warm welcome to anybody who's new here this evening. If it's your first time at Open Clock Club, and importantly, if you've bought our book this week, yay, thank you very much. It keeps their bills paid, just about. And of course, these sessions are really to support beginners. So if you let us know what your questions are, we'll answer them either on Facebook during the week or on our YouTube channel or in the next week's Open Clock Club. And that really kind of gets us off the starting line, because right at the end of last week's event, somebody asked about brass. I don't know who that was. I think it was about where do you get brass? And it kind of got me thinking that it would be useful, maybe, if we talked about the kinds of brass that we kind of use on a sort of day-by-day basis. So I'm going to do that. But remember, 2-3 weeks ago, we talked about refacing pallets, and we are finally going to get round to that process, or at least starting that process this week. I did think that I was going to make a pair of strip pallets live on air. So yesterday afternoon, I started knocking a pair out, which I've done, and I'll show you them in a minute. But it's not something I can do within an hour, I don't think. But anyway, so that might have to be a video, but I'll show you how far I've got and the problems I encountered and so on. But before we begin that, we got a question from one of our YouTube followers, and they asked about French clocks. And for those of you, for beginners, please bear with us. This is a 19th century or early 20th century French clock, and they're generically given the name pendule de Paris, which means clock, Parisian clock. But they were made in various centers around France to a pretty standardized kind of design from the 1860s on. And in this country, that's in the UK, maybe things have changed now, but certainly decades and decades ago when I started in horology, people actually turned their noses up at these clocks, but they're incredibly good quality and also amazingly good value for money. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you might see this thing stamped on the back plate, which is, if we just go to video, if you can see there, they call it medal, gold medal, Marty, and it's not a particularly good stamp, but you can just see there that it says 1900. So this clock was obviously made after 1900, and they really kept making them through the First World War and into the 20s and 30s, but the production fell off. They were still making them, Madame Lepé's factory back in the 1980s, because we had a brand new kind of version of it. So this one dates post 1900. And the question was from our YouTube subscriber, how do you set up the striking on these clocks if they're not marked? Now, those of you, and again, apologies for beginners, but this is all good stuff, we hope. There's a classic scenario, and we'll just unmute John for a minute. We haven't rehearsed this, have we, John? So you go to a client's house and they say, I've got a clock and it's stopped. And what's happened, John?
If it's one of these French clocks,
yeah,
it needs beat setting.
Right. And what happens if the hands are at 20 past midday?
Oh, the striking trains run down.
Right. Okay. So there are two
things
there. Thanks, John. And they're quite susceptible to being in beat. They're usually big, heavy stone cases, so they don't like it if they're on kind of wobbly side tables and hall tables and things. But they run really, really well once they're set up, as long as people don't muck about with the pallets too much. But it's a classic thing. If the hands have stopped at, let's just go back to a little bit of a wider view and get rid of that. If the hands have stopped somewhere around here and the hand is jammed, then that's because the striking train has failed to run. Now, the clocks run for 2 weeks, basically, on one winding, although it's advisable to wind them once a week. So our YouTube subscriber was asking, why is the clock stopping basically at either 20 past 12, or why, how do I get the striking train set up? So we're going to whiz off the hands and things. And he said, looking around for a pair of pliers. And I'll show you what to do. Now, some of them are marked, but there's a couple of things here, and I don't know whether you can see, if we just advance the striking. Right, so it's just struck past, but the hand is about 2 minutes past, and that's the same for the hour as well. So this is a question to chuck out for you to keep you busy while I'm working, is what has happened there? So it can be, well, actually it could be probably 3 things, but one very common problem with these clocks in relation to that idea that the hand jams at 20 past midday. Anyway, we'll just get the hands off and then we'll get into it. I might have to actually put some glasses on. Excuse fingers. Now, sometimes with these, the minute wheel cock is filed away, so you can get the hand and the hour wheel, the hour hand and the hour wheel come away in one piece, which is a much easier way of doing it, where if you're disassembling, because then you can get hold of the hour wheel, show you in a minute. But on this one, the minute wheel cock has not been cut away, so you have to get the hour hand off. So the whole thing, regrettably, can be slightly kind of brutal. There we are. It's just pushed onto a pipe. It wasn't too bad after all. This clock is actually in incredibly good condition. It's the only one I've ever seen. Again, for people who haven't seen the French clock before, you do the fine regulation by this little square at the top of the dial near the 12 there. Just what French clock is a way I can ID the maker. Yeah, if you want to ID the maker of these, there's a book by, the name will come to me in a minute, a kind of 20th century book, which is okay. Marble French clock by, anyway, you can Google it. But the classic work on French clocks is by Tardy. I think originally it was published in a few, that's it, thank you. Who's the, just hold it a bit higher so I can see the maker, the writer. Bit higher. Nicholas Thorpe. Brilliant. Well done, Ian. Thank you very much. So that book, I don't know what you think of it, Ian. That's quite a good book. It's shows us basically what I'm going to show you today. So there's quite a few makers in there. But if you really want to get to the heart of the thing, then Tardy is the kind of classic work for identifying French clockmakers. Thank you for that. Gosh, somebody who's got their books at hand. That's brilliant. So when we remove the dial and false plate, really nice. It's got this flash gilding, which is really thin, and I'm again, on my conservation soapbox, ever so easy to damage this surface, this kind of finish, because it's very sort of fragile. And then there's the Broco regulation that links the key at the front to the suspension at the back. So you regulate the thing from the front of the clock, which is quite nice. Right, I should have actually gotten even more organized, but anyway. So we can see the problem, or part of the problem here, with the striking. So we've got our rack here, we've got our rack arm here, not the rack tail, and we've got the snail. Now, if you're used to seeing kind of like regular rack striking work, the snail has got 12 individual steps on it that relate to the 12 hours of striking. Now, what you've got here is exactly the same thing, but those steps are all joined up. So it's a stepless snail, which the first time you see it, you think, gosh, how can that work? But it works very, very well indeed. And if we just, I'll just point a few things out as we go along, if that's all right. Hopefully it's interesting and moderately helpful. Many of these clocks are marked when they're made by the maker. And what I'm interested in here, if you look on the minute cannon wheel square, cannon pipe square, there's a file mark across. Now, again, I'm hardly ever off my soapbox, but I wrote somewhere or said something recently about marking clocks. It's not necessary, and sorry if this sounds rude, but it's not necessary to actively mark clocks when you take them apart. You know, striking barrels, going barrels. The barrels on these are kind of interchangeable. Not that you should interchange them, but they were marked by the maker. And there are always tiny little marks that you can note in your daybook. So these marks are made by the maker. And that mark there is where your minute hand goes. So that goes in line with the minute hand, which is useful if you've never seen that before. Now, this is a rack striking clock. If we had a count wheel striking clock, which would be on the back plate, the boss of the count wheel and the count wheel arbor square is also marked in a similar way. So it just makes putting the thing together dead easy. So I'm going to do what you should never do, of course, and just whiz the hands around. And right, okay, just there we are. So we're coming up to maybe 11, and we should, that's right. The rack doesn't drop at the half hour. We just get one strike. Let's just do that again. There we are. Clock's just struck once. But what happens if the motion work isn't set up properly? The motion work, by the way, is the collective name for a subset of under dial work. So that's the movement frame, the kind of chassis, if you like, is called the frame, and that comprises the plates and the pillars. And then between the front of the front plate and the back of the dial is a whole lot of gubbins, in this case, which is collectively called under dial work, and the motion work is a subset of that. And it comprises the hour wheel here, the minute wheel, which is down there. Slightly counterintuitively, the minute wheel doesn't have a minute hand on it, but anyway, and then the cannon wheel here in the middle. So we've basically got three components, and they have a very specific phase relationship, because what happens if that phase relationship isn't set correctly, then when the clock comes to strike, can you see? Yeah, you can see midday. You can see what's happened is that the rack has dropped, but it's actually dropped against the vertical face of the snail, or the radial step between 12 and 1 o'clock. So there's a few minutes between the clock preparing to strike, which is called warning for non-new starters, and when the clock actually strikes, you'll hear this kind of whizzing noise. And what happens is the clock continues to run. The rack has dropped against the radial face of the snail here, and then it jams. But because the striking work, you can see, is kind of directly related to the going or the time ticking of the clock, then the clock can move on a few minutes. Now, what's meant to happen is this is designed in such a way that if it's clean or with a little bit of oil or dry lubricant on it, then the snail will actually be pushed up that radial face. But the reality is that once that oil gets sticky, there's too much friction and the whole thing jams. So a long way of saying it's really important that you get the phase relationship right. Now on this clock, the wheels are marked, so life's easy if you see those marks. But just bear in mind, remember, this clock strikes 2 minutes too late, and there are kind of 3 reasons why that might be, sorry. So let's just whip our motion work off here. So this is the minute wheel. So this a little L-shaped bracket is called the minute wheel cock. And let's just do that and whiz this off and whiz this off. And again, for beginners, underneath there, like in most clockwork, you have, can you see that? You've got, clock's nice and oily, by the way. You've got a hole, a single kind of drilled hole, which is a clearance hole for the screw, and 2 little very, very slightly tapered pins, and they're called steady pins. And they're the things that actually locate the component in place, which is kind of quite interesting, really, because people tend to look at clocks when they're in bits and say there are hundreds of bits and it's all complicated, which is true. But the beauty is a clock like this can only go together in one order because those steady pins are to a degree kind of hand placed positions, so they're not interchangeable. They look very similar. So the hour wheel, which is this component here, and the snail, you can see they're fixed together, they're screwed together. So we can just whiz those off. This is batch produced. You can see this is batch number 3 of, I don't know how many. I've seen these numbers go up to 6. Anybody who's worked on French clocks, any ideas about the batch numbering? But anyway, this is number 3 of so many. And then when we get inside, a bit further inside, you can see that the cannon wheel and the minute wheel have both got dots on. But luckily here, you can also see that the person that reassembled this last either didn't know about those or whatever anyway. Those dots quite kind of logically should be aligned. So they should be something like that when we put them together. Is that right? Maybe it's still one tooth off. Let's just get, just pass an eyeglass for me, Frankie, from the top drawer there, just that drawer. Thank you. Team Open Clock Club jumps into action. How's the live chat? Yeah, good. Big thumbs up from the live chat. Thank you. Right. Right. Actually, quite interestingly, on this one, they are marked, but they're both very close to a tooth. Obviously, one of the marks should be on a tooth, and one of the marks should be on a tooth gap or a dedenda. And in this case, they're both on a tooth, so we'll have to guess a little bit where they go. But let's just investigate a bit further this, because you remember in the live chat, what are the 3 reasons why it's maybe striking 2 minutes too late? Have we had any answers to that, Rachel? No answers. Right, okay, no answers. So one of them might be relating to the hand, that maybe somebody has put a square thing inside here, like a tang of a file, and tried to, out of focus, tried to bend the hand round. And on some clocks, you can actually move the collet in relation to the hand. But on these, they're really heavily riveted. So if you find one that's been repaired, then that's what's happened typically. Or maybe somebody just shoved the hand round when it's jammed. In this case, it can't move. You would destroy the hand by moving the rivet round. Do you deliberately put those wheels out of alignment? No, honestly, I didn't deliberately put the wheels out of alignment. So it's not that in this case. The hand and the collet are aligned. They're absolutely fine. So the second thing is the cannon, the friction work on this is like a watch. We just whiz it off. You can see, kind of like a watch anyway, that the cannon pipe is filed away and kind of squidged together a little bit, which gives us the friction. It grips onto the tapered center arbor. And if you look at the little pins on the back, sometimes again, these have been mutilated. In this case, they haven't. These marks are from when the clock was made, just the final kind of finishing of the pins, I think. So the reason our hand is striking 2 minutes too late is there, look, the cannon pipe is twisted. So the clock has presumably stopped at 20 past the hour. Somebody's tried to force the hand forward maybe, and it's twisted the pipe. So we need to twist that back. So the question is, how do you, I suppose, how do you twist it back? I haven't actually thought that far, but given our new skill in making brass spanners, I'd make a square hole in a bit of brass which holds this end. I'd put a bit of filed brass down the middle to support it. And then this end holding it is slightly different. It might actually be that you could just hold it in your fingers, or you could wrap a bit of leather around there. Otherwise, what you could do is you could, when your clock goes into 1 inch of the rack, hook clear all the rack teeth as the rack drops. Good question. We'll come back to that question. But what I would do in terms of holding this, if you're really difficult, is to something like, I would make a hole in a bit of brass the right size, like that, and then I would sew it here to cut a gap, and then just close this so it just kind of held the thing the whole way around, something like that, maybe, to prevent it from becoming damaged. So what was the question? So that needs straightening up. Okay, the cannon pipe needs straightening up, which we're not going to do now, but we can maybe do it next week. We'll reassemble with the wheels in the right order. Brake soon. Oh, brake soon. Gosh, doesn't time fly when you're having fun? Let's have a look. Yeah, brake in, well, I'll tell you what, we'll have a comfort brake, but you've just seen me put the minute wheel on. I'll get to the next stage by the time we come back. So we'll come back at 25 past, okay? And we just give us a minute to have a little comfort break, okay? Question that came in was, should have changed my jacket for a blue one anyway. Should the rack hook clear the rack teeth when the rack drops? And the answer is, it doesn't matter. It's nice if it does, and I'll demonstrate it when we get the motion work back together. It's nice if it does, but don't go filing it if it doesn't. Normally what you find is the last tooth is left ever so slightly longer than the rest. So when the rack hook clears the rack drops cleanly. And on some clocks, you hear it fall in 2 or 3 teeth, and it falls another couple of teeth, and it falls the whole way down. And yeah, it sounds clumsy, but unless there's good evidence that somebody has filed it or bent it, leave it alone, particularly with those kind of quarter striking, what do they call them? They're German ones, so Winterhalter and Hofmeier, that do kind of quite clever quarter striking. If you start filing and bending those rack teeth, you're going to get into all sorts of problems. I've been there. I'll demonstrate that for people who are catching up with us, who are new today. So yeah, we've got a big thumbs up from the live chat. So we can see our 2 dots are together here, and you can see the 3rd dot there on the rim of the hour wheel. So that, I used to think, goes at the top like this, but it doesn't. It goes in line with the pinion. And again, I'll have to get my eyeglass out and have a little look. Yeah, the question was the rack an improvement from the count wheel? A question, history question about rack and count wheel. Is that from you, Rob, or are you saying it was an improvement? No, it wasn't. It wasn't improvement. No, it wasn't improvement. No. Good job. Rob's banging his head on the bench. The count wheel striking is a sequential system. Okay, it's the earlier type of striking. So with a clock with count wheel striking, the striking goes from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 and so on. And you can't shortcut that system. So it's relatively easy to get the hands and the striking out of sync. So you've got to, as a user, you've got to learn a trick of resynchronizing the two. With rack striking, life's easy, because as long as the hand doesn't move like this on the pipe, then basically the hour hand and the striking always agree, which some people might think is a better system. You know, I don't know. The reason rack striking came around wasn't because of rack striking clocks like this. It was because of pull quarter repeating. If you want to repeat your clock, as in, I mean, you know, you want to find out what time it is when it isn't striking the hour and it's the middle of the night, let's say. You pull a little string and it repeats the last hour struck. You can't do that with count wheel striking because it's moved on another station. So rack striking, I think, came out of pull quarter repeat work, and then some clever people said it was a better system. I don't know. It's so I always find it kind of like quite funny, and when it's like with 30-hour clocks and 8-day clocks, it's sort of this old thing that 30-hour clocks were for poor people and 8-day clocks were for posh people, and of course that just wasn't the case. There are some really incredible 30-hour clocks by big names, Nabe and Quare, which are totally beautifully made and as well made as an 8-day clock, and were probably as expensive. So there's a whole lot more to it than that. And of course, the whole crossover of technologies isn't stop and start, which is why count wheel striking clocks in French clocks kept being made kind of right up to the early parts of the 20th century. Rack didn't come in, and even though it's a far superior system, for whatever reason, they kept making count wheel clocks. Anyway, so the question was about this step here on the snail. So now it's cost good practice, oh, there we are, not to whiz the hands round, but I'm going to do it anyway. A prerogative like this, and let's just have a look now. So great. Another thing here about setting up, which is quite interesting, is that when I reassemble these clocks, I don't know whether you can see this little device here, but it's called the gathering pallet. And it's about parallel with the rack as it is. And it's absolutely fine. It has to be clear of the rack after warning. But as a rule of thumb, I'd always kind of learn, just it's an easy thing to remember, to have the gathering pallet perpendicular to the rack when the train is locked. But again, if anybody's got a view on that, I'd be interested to know why. I suppose it gathers the rack a bit closer. So let's have a look how we're getting on now. You can see, so the rack won't drop now because it's 11:30. I've got my finger in the way. There we are. So just struck once, and we'll go up to midday. Let's just go back a little bit, because what we want, of course, is to see whether the rack clears the rack hook in one fell swoop. Should be originally been made so the teeth clear the rack hook. I don't know. Let's have a look. Let's have a look. See if this, if we can do it slow enough. So yeah, it kind of did, didn't it? It once it had got past the first tooth or so on, we could probably go back and forward and back and forward. No, there's not a lot in it. It's all pretty radial. You can hear them. You hear that? Them touching the whole way down. So for slightly, I've gone off on a tangent here. So if this tooth here was very, very slightly longer, when this device, which is called the rack hook, had moved out far enough to clear this one, it would clear them all and the rack would drop cleanly. In this case, they just seem to be part of a wheel. So unless that tooth has worn more, but I don't really see why it would. So I think in this case, the rack, that tooth isn't longer. But of course, the minute you say, and if you hear anybody saying, oh, they're all like this or all like that, then for me, this enormous kind of klaxon starts ringing in my brain, because the minute you say they were definitely all this, then you find one the next day that disproves it. Okay, so where were we? I think we're about done actually. So, oh, I know what we're going to do. Let's just go back and do it again. Sorry, with my no, I think what's going on here. Oh, I see that. There we are. So the answer is, how much clearance do we have there? I don't know whether you can see, but not an enormous amount. Look, when the rack drops. But you must have clearance there is the point. So if, let's say, our clock doesn't strike, how far will the hands go before it jams there? So they'll go to about 10 minutes past, 7 minutes past or something like that. Then the thing will jam. So what I might do on this is actually to move the hour wheel round one more tooth. So let's just go to 1/2 past, because I suppose what you might want, yeah, maybe at 1/2 past, you want the nose here at 1 o'clock to be in line with the rack arm. If for some reason it drops like this, it doesn't drop onto the step of the snail. So it's kind of a safety device if it's set up like that. I'm making it up as I go along. Anyway, so we've got a bit of clearance, but only about 7 minutes. But of course, that's all you need as long as the clock strikes. Then we come round to 1, and oh, the fingers are in the way again. There we go. It strikes 1. Cool, good. A bit of a distraction there. What are we doing? 34. Great. Let's just have a quick whiz through some brasses, unless there are any more questions on French clocks. So somebody said, where do you get brass from? Well, in the UK, we used to get it from Smith's Metals when I was at the college. But of course, we were buying a whole sheet then, like a 4 foot by 2 foot, was it? Or something sheet, which was great because we had 10 students and we used to chew through the whole thing. And I've had a look this week, and you can buy the different kind of grades of brasses reasonably inexpensively, but the problem is if you buy small bits, it's disproportionately expensive. So I guess, could the ambiguous dots be culprits, Rob? Could the ambiguous, yeah, maybe they are, Rob. You're maybe right. Maybe those quick dots on the motion work have actually caused that problem and twisted the cannon wheel. But for next week, if I get time, I'll make a little tool to grip the wheel as well, and we'll straighten it up live on air. There's a disaster happening. So I don't know what happens with the NAWCC, but it would seem to me, for somebody who's got a machine shop or a bandsaw, that if you club together and buy a sheet of 2 mil, 3 mil, 4 mil, whatever, imperial, CZ 108, 120, 121, or whatever grades you want, then it's going to be really inexpensive. That would seem to be a kind of sensible thing to do. So club together, and maybe the BHI do that in this country already. It would seem to be a sensible idea. Otherwise, you just pay a lot for the different grades. Okay, so here, and of course, the different international standards have got different numbers, but I still use a slightly old-fashioned system, which is, and I can write this down, or could you put it in the live chat, Rach? So CZ of copper zinc 108. So CZ 108 is our first one. Now this is, brass is copper and zinc, and it has no lead in it. And the beauty about CZ 108 is it's really great for cold working. Now this is quite thin sort of shim stock, as you can see. If I'll write it on there, then it's there forever. If you want to make a spring, a boat or bowspring for behind the cannon wheel on a long case clock, for instance, this stuff is incredibly useful because you can hammer it, you can harden it, you can anneal it, you can do all sorts with it. So you might say, well, why don't you use this for everything? Well, the answer is the reason you don't use it for things like train wheels is that the point of the lead in the mix, I won't call it an alloy, is to break up the material into granules. So if you're cutting a wheel with a fast revolving cutter, CZ08 would work, but it's kind of like really chewy and not free cutting. So CZ108 or the equivalent wherever you are is incredibly useful for making springs and so on. And I'll just show you, if we've got time, which we may not, about annealing brass and work hardening it, because again, they're incredibly useful sort of tools for the clockmaker. So there are two other grades, and as much as I would never, and I've bitched on about this, put Sharpie pen on an old clock, on sheet material that you're going to refinish as part of a manufacturing process, it's really useful to write all over it when you first get it, because once you've cut a bit off, of course, you have to know your brass. And my former students will roll their eyes at this. And of course, there's a good way of knowing your brass, and that's just to look at it for about an hour. And once you actually look at it and smell it and listen to it and internalize it, you don't need really to know what it is. You can just look at a piece and say, I think that's, there's a big, actually, textural difference between CZ108 and CZ, in this case, 120, which has got about 1% lead. So I think this is called engraving brass. And really irritatingly, when I started in clockmaking, people who were in the know called it compo. Like, what does that mean? Composition, presumably, but does it mean it's compostable? Is it like an early green, you know, eco brass or something? Who knows? Anyway, we call it CZ120, and it's got 1% lead in it. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So this is free cutting to a degree, but if you've got a factory and it's churning out those, you know, those nuts and bolts and things that you buy down the DIY center, that very pale colored brass, that's something like CZ121, which has got, I think, about 2% brass. So that's very, maybe something like this, very free cutting. It's very pale when you first file it, like a pale whitey color. It tarnishes very quickly. Now that's great if you've got a robotic machine churning out threads quicker than you can see them, but it's not really any good for a clockmaker because it doesn't look clocky. And also it's really poor at cold working. So if you wanted to bend a bit, for instance, if you're making a bracket or something, you want to forge it round, unless it's heated, it'll crack and break. So for your kind of free cutting material, CZ120 is the way to go, or the equivalent. And for making springs and things, CZ108 is useful. Now, I did promise we'd talk about pallets, so I'm only going to go on for a couple more minutes about brass, but we can come back to it if anybody's interested. 2% brass, 2% lead. Sorry, did I say 2% brass? Yeah. What was that last question, Frankie, before that? No, it was on the bit of paper. Anyway, so just quickly, other things that you might come across at brass in clockmaking. If you're doing restoration work, and this is a whole other subject, is that people say, and I'm not arguing for or against it, you should use, how do you troubleshoot a minute hand on a French clock that has a proper tension? All right, is this the friction, like how much friction with the clutch there is? We'll do that next week. We'll make the little clamp thing to hold the wheel, straighten that up, and I'll show you how to adjust the cannon tension, because like on a watch, if you do it without something in the middle to support it, it just squidges in and then it's either too tight or too slack. So this is cast brass. So it's yellow brass, so it's a high copper, relatively high copper content, and you can buy it either in castings, like the back cock here for a verge clock or a bracket clock. There's a big old wheel casting here, some sheet that I've probably done some away, and some brass rod. Now this is kind of relatively expensive. 2, 2, 3. 27. Relatively expensive. But if you want that kind of yellow color, it's kind of a way of getting that. Now, I'm not personally convinced that when you put new parts on, they have to look like the old parts. Without going off on one, as they say around these parts, the new parts. And I'm perfectly happy. In fact, I would really strongly advocate that anything new you fit, you stamp it with your name and the date of manufacture so it can be identified at a later period. One of I think it was Sam, worked on a Westminster striking clock this week, done a really brilliant job, and thanks for sharing, Sam. And one thing about those clocks is if you ever see the gongs out of them, they're often made out of bronze, which is a really useful material to have kicking around. So that's quite nice. You can make screwdrivers and things out of it. And the last thing I'll show you on brass, and we might have to come back to it or I'll do a video, is this, which is hard drawn brass wire. So this, as you can see, is already quite springy. We'll maybe do annealing and hardening, work hardening next week. Otherwise, we're not going to get started on pallets this week. But this is incredibly useful for making into rivets. In the old days when I was in the jewelry trade, I repaired endless watch bracelets with it, make brooch pins. If you replace a fly on a long case clock movement, really great for the rivets there. You can anneal it with a little gas torch and then reharden it again. If you've got a mantle clock that's got those blued steel wire springs, they sometimes get broken off at the foot. And this actually makes a really good replacement. This is good to buy. Now, unfortunately, like everything else in the world, you can't buy it in this kind of format anymore, but you can buy loose wire, and there's a lot of clock kind of workshops that are disassembled, so you can still find it on eBay. I'd buy that brass wire, it's incredibly useful. We'll come back to annealing and hardening next week, but we'll make a 10-minute start on our refacing pallets in a minute. So let's have a wee break. We'll come back at 46, so not long, but see you in a minute. Okay, great, good. Thanks for keeping up with the live chat. All brilliant. We've had a jacket change. It wasn't matching the shirt, so there was a lot of hating going on. Right, refacing pallets. This is going to take quite a while. We won't get that far today, but we'll make a start. I did, as I said, try make a pair like this of strip pallets, which was all right. It's absolutely fine, but it took me longer than I can do it just you know, as a live demo. So I'm going to do a YouTube video of this in the next 2 or 3 weeks or something. We've got a lot of YouTube videos sort of lined up. But anyway, we'll come back to that as well. So we've got our long case clock pallets, let's say, for instance. You may remember, let's just turn them around, that a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the importance of figuring out the angles before you start bending things or refacing. Again, unless there's evidence that the pallet frame has already been bent and you're bending it back, don't bend the pallet frame. It's as simple as that. If the drops are that bad, and I'll explain what that means in a minute, then reface by all means. These have both been refaced. I'm going to take one of those facings off and redo it, which might not be today, but anyway, we'll crack on with it. So let's just have a very quick recap for people who are new this week. So yeah, let's look at it that way around. Okay, so the active surface here is this face and the face in there, pallet faces. And so we'll just draw those in that kind of classic square escapement, 30-tooth, long case clock, tall case clock that we talked about a couple of weeks ago. Now I'm going to draw the pallets really close together because this is a kind of theory thing. So just so you can get a kind of idea. I've obviously drawn them squidged in for a reason. So what we're interested in is drop here. That's free rotation of the escape wheel. Can pallets far away from the escape wheel? No, if the pallets are engaging with the escapement, somebody asked if the pallets are too far, will that affect the duration of the clock? What it'll mean is basically your clock. We talked about supplementary arc a couple of weeks ago, and we'll come back to that question. Yes, the answer is if the escapement isn't efficient and driving the pendulum, we lose supplementary arc to the point the clock stops. So yes and no is the answer. Good question. We might have to come back to that, but certainly a problem. So what we're interested in is drop, that free rotation of the escape wheel and train, which we want to keep to a minimum, maybe for that reason, to keep as much energy being fed into the pendulum. So if we've got our escape wheel tooth, let's draw it here. And let's just draw one here. And let's draw one here. And let's draw one here, like that. Remember, if you were here a couple of weeks ago, if not, I only think of one tooth at once. That's as much as my brain can manage. So they're all the same tooth, okay? So we're taking this one first. When it reaches, it's going in this direction. When it reaches the end of the entry pallet here, it drops and is effectively that tooth there. And this tooth slides down here and becomes this tooth, which goes all the way around and lands on here. This tooth then becomes this tooth. So it's this value here and this value here we're interested in keeping to a minimum. So what happens is, drawing is going to improve significantly. As that escape wheel tooth lands on these pallets, it wears them away. It wears the wheel smaller, but you don't see that, of course, because they're all wearing down at the same rate and there are 30 teeth and 2 pallets. So what happens is, if we're looking sideways on, is you get a little divot. It's actually something slightly exaggerated, but like this. Something like that. You usually get a bigger divot here where the tooth lands, then you've got recoil. So on one part of that pallet face, the tooth is going in one direction and it's coming back again. So maybe actually it's more like that. Anyway, that wear means that the value between here and here increases, and here increases. So we get more and more and more and more drop. On our strip pallet clock, we can adjust that by changing the center distance to a degree. But on this long case clock, you can't, because it's got those steady pins we talked about. So don't go bending anything. What we might eventually decide to do is to replace this bit of material here with a new bit. And we call this refacing the pallets. Yeah, we do it occasionally. Often it looks kind of worse than it is. It's like everything I seem to talk about. Don't do it if you don't have to do it. So just think about this. There are two ways of doing it. One, if this wear isn't too bad, you can put one piece of material on here. Should use a different color. One piece of material on here that is both thicker and longer than the pallet. So that's reducing drop here, and it's reducing drop here as well. So that's an option, you know, if the pallets actually aren't too worn. But what I would say, if they aren't too worn, but you can't get some material in there, then they aren't kind of worn enough. Or what happens normally is that you actually put on two pieces of material. So you put on a piece of material on this pallet too, and you incrementally shorten them like this until you get the clock ticking with a minimum amount of drop. And that is what's happened here. I don't know whether you can see, but both pallets have been refaced with bits of steel. And interestingly, because this was done by one of my lovely students, who are the most conservative clockmakers on the planet, they haven't refinished this face look. It's still all gorgeous and as it was. What they've done is they've left the pallet about 0.2 of a millimeter too wide. So they've just finished down until they nearly touch that surface. That's really nice. At least you're kind of maintaining as much evidence as possible. Okay, so if we decide to do this for whatever reason, then how do you do it? Now, we're obviously going to run out of time today, but there are two ways of doing it. I think this one, which is the kind of traditional way, has been done by soldering on a bit of mainspring. Now, let's just look at this pallet here. You can see that it's not flat, it's slightly curved to reduce recoil. And this one here is straight. Now, we don't know whether that's how the clock left the factory or not, but what we're going to do, as long as we think it's going to work all right, is we're going to respect those angles and try and maintain them. So there is an argument for instance, filing this back and soldering on a big chunky bit of material. And the beauty of that method is once you do it, then all you do forever is replace that bit of material. There's also an argument for sawing. If you imagine the pallet is not refaced, putting a slot here like that with a circular saw, so you keep this kind of existing surface and you put a hardened steel insert there. And again, it's pretty interventive, but once you've done it, you've done it. This is kind of an option normally on deadbeat pallets. Deadbeat pallets don't bend the pallet frame in, I'm afraid, despite what you might hear elsewhere. Right, okay, so we've got either soldering on a thin bit of metal or soldering, cutting back and soldering on a thicker bit of metal. You people have to live with your conscience. So whichever you decide to do. And this is the thing that's come out of the Facebook discussion all week, is it doesn't really matter to me anyway what you do. It's the dialogue and the engagement and the relative amount of open-mindedness that's really important. And again, if you hear people saying, that's the wrong way, that's the right way, that's the proper way, and all those things, then for me, that just is a massive turnoff. But anyway, micro welding, yeah. About 20 years ago, people started micro welding pinions. So filling in the gap in the pinion with where it needs more research, but it's certainly a possibility. I've seen it done. and there were different hardnesses of filler. I think the problem with micro welding was always the barrier on opinion between the host material and the new material. And if that's particularly hard, then that can cause more damage, but it's an option. Filling on turret clocks, filling with a sintered epoxy is another option. There's all sorts you can go for. So the point is keep the dialogue and the conversation going. So we've got here our mainspring, and somewhere, where's that bit of steel? Right, okay. So this is, how are we doing for time? Oh, great, we've got 4 minutes, got loads of time. These are clock and watch mainsprings, okay, from 20th century stuff. If you're looking to solder on a piece of material, what you want is a spring that looks kind of like this, blued steel. What you don't want is a spring that's more like this, or even worse, like that, because these more modern complex steels that they put in watch mainsprings and things are really difficult to solder. So if you're going to reface with a bit of old spring, then use a bit of blued steel spring like this. So let's just liberate a bit. Now, often you'll see that people solder this on direct. So they cut a piece out and they solder it straight onto the pallet face. That's kind of fine, I guess, because we've just seen with snapping it a big bit off that it's quite hard. But you also see blued steel pallet slips that wear quite quickly. So what I do is I anneal them first, then solder them on, trim them nearly to size, take them off, harden them dead hard, like glass hard, leave them dead hard, and fit them back on again, which is a bit of a faff, but it's probably a way of guaranteeing the material is hard. So blued steel spring is one way of doing it, and we'll come back to that. And the other way is to get a bit of tool steel. So this is that upside down for you? That's better. As you can see, it's called ground flat stock. I don't know what they call it. What do they call it in the States, Rob? Put it on the live chat. Or it's also sometimes called gauge plate. And you can see here, it's a 1% carbon thereabouts, and it's got a whole lot of other junk in it. And it comes in this format that has a very high quality ground finish, which is down to dimension. So this is a super high quality tool steel that when it comes in its annealed format like this is 1 millimeter thick. But when you harden it, it is like the hard thing. So it's really cool for making dies and tools and stuff like that. So there are your two options on, or my two options anyway, for a starter on materials. So it's going to be next week now, I'm afraid, but we've made a start at least. I'm going to anneal the clock mainspring live on air, fit it onto my pallet, then take it off again, harden it, and fit it back on again. And then we can kick it about on the live chat. And we'll also look at how you would do it with a bit of gauge plate as well. So as always, thank you very much for bearing with our kind of rapid fire open clock club this week, particularly to people who are here for the first time. Heck of a lot to take in. Please come back to us. Please come back next week. Don't be scared off. If there's anything from the book, particularly about the single train Enfield, that you want to ask questions, then let us know on Facebook or on the YouTube, or get in touch with us through our website, and we can tackle those questions next week in Open Clock Club. So we're going to try and deal with work hardening and annealing brass, which is a useful thing to do. And we're going to make some progress on refacing our pallets. So as always, thank you very much to Team Open Clock Club here. Thanks to John and Rob and everybody who's become a regular here. So great to see you all. Have a great horological week. Keep us in the loop of all those cool projects you're doing. And we're going to leave the live chat open till 7:05 GMT, so we can all kind of say goodbye and stuff like that. So brilliant to see you all, and we'll see you all same time next week. Thank you.